It started with silence, thick, unnatural, and wrong. Deep in the northern Montana wilderness, veteran woodsman Jack Whitaker paused mid-step. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had stilled. Even the stream that usually gurgled cheerfully through Cotton Ridge clearing seemed to hold its breath. That's when he saw her. A shadow at first. Then the shape emerged fully into view, a lynx, gaunt and limping, her eyes wild but focused. She stared straight at him from across the glen, not as predator or prey, but as something else. Something desperate. Something deliberate. And then came the sound. A strange, haunting chirp, sharp and trembling. Two small cubs stepped out of the underbrush, barely able to keep their footing. Behind them, the mother lynx cried out again. Not in pain. Not in fear. In plea. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. In all his years tracking animals through the wilderness, he had never seen anything like this. She wasn't running from him. She wasn't threatening him. She was calling to him. And in that breathless moment, surrounded by whispering pines and fading light, Jack realized something he would never forget. The wild doesn't beg for help. Unless it has no other choice. In the golden hush of late October, nestled deep in the whispering pine valleys of northern Montana, Jack Whitaker moved through the woods like he was born from them. A seasoned woodsman raised by a father who taught him to respect the rhythm of nature more than the ticking of any clock, Jack knew these hills. Knew where the elk bedded down, where foxes crossed streambeds at dusk, and where the wind shifted before a storm. That afternoon had started like many others. Jack had been tracking a wounded mule deer on the ridge above Silver Hollow, not to claim a trophy, but to end its suffering. Some weekend hunter, likely from the city, had taken a poor shot and left the buck limping through the backcountry, bleeding into the leaves. For Jack, that was an offense to the land. If you take a life, his father used to say, you better be there for the whole story, not just the beginning. After a long, respectful finish and a clean field dressing, Jack found himself in Coyote Glen, a quiet clearing he often returned to. A downed cottonwood made the perfect place to sit, rest, and watch. The light filtered through the branches like liquid gold, and a thin stream trickled nearby, gurgling its endless story into the soil. Jack took out his thermos of coffee and a sandwich of smoked elk meat and horseradish, letting the quiet settle over him like an old friend. That's when he felt it. A shift in the silence. Not the nervous tension of prey, not the stomping clumsiness of a bear. This was different. Intentional. Watching. Jack didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't move at all, not at first. Instead, he listened. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, not in fear, but in recognition. Something wild was closer than it should be. From the edge of the glen, between the thick brambles and shadows, emerged a female lynx. Her coat was mottled with burrs and dust, and she limped visibly, her back leg dragging behind her. But it was her eyes that stopped Jack cold. Wide, fierce, and fixed on him, not with fear, not with malice, but with something else. Something ancient and almost pleading. Then, from behind her, a tiny cub stumbled out. And another. Jack's breath caught. The mother lynx took another step forward, wincing with the effort, and made a sound he had only ever heard in documentaries, a chirping cry, soft and high, meant only for her young. But she looked directly at Jack when she made it. It wasn't desperation. It was trust. And it would change everything. Jack sat frozen on the fallen cottonwood, his sandwich forgotten in his hand. The lynx stood barely 15 feet away now, her breathing shallow, her injured leg trembling with effort. Her two cubs, no more than a couple months old, clung close to her side. One stumbled, the other mewed softly. Jack's heart thudded, not with fear, but with something deeper. Something that felt like awe. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The forest held its breath. Then the lynx made that chirping sound again, turned her head, and looked back toward the shadows she had come from. Jack followed her gaze instinctively, and saw nothing at first. Then came a flicker of movement. Another cub? No, just shadows shifting. But then she turned back to him, and there was no mistaking it now. She was asking him for help. Jack slowly set his sandwich down on the log and raised both palms in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy, girl," he said gently, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The lynx didn't retreat. She simply stood there, panting, eyes locked with his, as though trying to measure the weight of his soul. Jack knew he was crossing a line. Every instinct he'd been raised with said wild was wild, and man should keep his distance. But something about this moment, the pain in her limp, the way her cubs trembled, the quiet dignity with which she stood her ground, it struck a chord so deep he couldn't ignore it. He reached into his pack, not for a weapon, but for his first aid kit. He kept it on hand for emergencies, mostly for himself, sometimes for a dog or a dumb client who tripped over a log on one of his guided hunts. Now, he unzipped it slowly and pulled out a bottle of iodine and a roll of bandages. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he murmured again. "But you gotta let me close." At the first sign of movement toward her, the lynx let out a warning growl. Her cubs ducked behind her legs. Jack stopped immediately. "All right," he said, backing off. "Not like that." "I get it." They stayed in that strange standoff for what felt like forever, Jack speaking softly, the lynx standing guard. The cubs grew restless, tumbling in the leaves, then hurrying back to her side when she chirped. Finally, dusk began to descend. The forest turned gold, then violet. Jack knew he couldn't stay out much longer, especially not with wounded animals nearby and no shelter prepared. But as he slung his pack over his shoulder and stood to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of soft paws behind him. He turned. The lynx was following him, slowly, carefully, her cubs stumbling along behind. Jack's throat tightened. "You're really coming with me, aren't you?" They walked together in the darkening woods, a man and a family of lynx, united by something neither of them could name. By the time Jack reached the edge of his property, twilight had fallen into full darkness. His cabin lights, faint through the trees, flickered like distant lanterns guiding a strange parade home. He paused near the tree line and turned. The lynx stopped just behind him, her cubs pressing against her legs, wide-eyed and shivering in the cold. Her injured leg trembled beneath her weight, but she stood tall, as if she refused to show weakness, even now. "You can't come inside," Jack murmured. "But I've got a place." He led them quietly toward an old equipment shed that stood about 30 yards from the cabin. It hadn't seen much use lately, just held a few sacks of seed, some rusted tools, and a stack of moving blankets that had belonged to his late father. Jack opened the creaky door, the scent of old wood and earth spilling out. He moved quickly, clearing a space in the corner. He laid the blankets down in a thick pile and set out a shallow pan of water. From his pack, he unwrapped the remains of his sandwich and placed the meat on a scrap of cloth. "It's not much," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "but it's dry. And safe." The lynx watched from the shadows. Her eyes reflected the lantern light in sharp yellow glints, intelligent, wary, unreadable. Then, after what felt like a silent negotiation, she limped forward. The cubs bounded after her, too young to be cautious. Jack stepped back, giving them space. He didn't close the door fully, just enough to keep the cold out, but leave them an escape if they needed it. Back inside the cabin, he stood by the kitchen window, watching the dark outline of the shed through the trees. She had gone in. He ran a hand through his hair, half in disbelief. "What the hell are we doing?" he muttered. "Wild cats in my shed. What would Dad say?" But he already knew. His father had always spoken of rare moments in the woods, moments when the wild seemed to reach out, to blur the line between animal and man. "Pay attention, son," he used to say. The forest speaks, but only to those who listen. That night, Jack barely slept. Every creak in the floor, every gust of wind, sent him checking the window to make sure they were still there. And each time, they were, three shapes huddled in the dim light, breathing slowly against the cold. In the morning, he called the only person he trusted enough to tell, Dr. Ellie Carter, the local vet, and someone who had stitched him up more than once when he refused to go to the hospital. When he explained what had happened, she paused, then said, "Jack, that's not just unusual. That's something else entirely." "Will you help me?" he asked. "I'll be there by sunrise," she replied. "And Jack? Don't do anything stupid. That lynx may trust you, but she's still wild." "I know," he said quietly, "but I think, she's asking for more than just shelter." The sky was still painted in shades of deep indigo and ash gray when Ellie Carter's dusty old pickup crunched down Jack's gravel drive. Jack was already up, coffee in hand, pacing his porch as steam curled from the mug and breath. The light in the shed still glowed faintly through the slats, a quiet beacon in the cold morning air. Ellie stepped out, bundled in flannel and a down vest, a large medical kit slung over one shoulder. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, eyeing Jack. "I didn't," he replied. "I kept expecting them to bolt. But they didn't." Ellie followed his gaze toward the shed. "She's still in there?" Jack nodded. "With the cubs. Didn't touch the venison I left last night, though." They approached slowly, respectfully. Jack called out in a low voice, "We're back." "Brought help." From inside came a low growl. Not a threat, but a warning. Ellie crouched, peeking through the slightly open door. "She's alert. Guarding them, but not aggressive." Ellie opened her kit and pulled out a small syringe. "I'd rather not dart her unless I absolutely have to. This," she held up a vial of cloudy liquid, "is a sedative mixed with pain meds. If we can get her to eat this, it'll knock her down gently." Jack returned with a fresh cut of venison from the freezer. Ellie injected the sedative into the meat and mixed it thoroughly. Jack placed the bowl just inside the doorway, then stepped back. And waited. Minutes crawled by. Then, slowly, the mother lynx emerged. She sniffed the air, her head low, body tense. Her injured leg dragged behind her awkwardly. Finally, she limped to the bowl, took one bite, then another. Jack and Ellie watched from the porch. "You ever seen anything like this?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "No. Wild cats don't seek people out, especially not with young. But this isn't instinct. This is choice." 20 minutes later, the lynx lay in the corner of the shed, conscious but groggy. The cubs curled against her side. Ellie moved in, slow and quiet. Jack stayed just outside the door, murmuring calmly. "She's letting me close," Ellie whispered. "That's rare." She examined the wound. Clean gunshot. Probably a .22. Small caliber, but it fractured the tibia. Lucky it didn't hit an artery. For the next hour, Ellie worked, cleaning the wound, setting the bone, applying a waterproof splint. The mother stirred occasionally, letting out a soft cry of discomfort, but never lashed out. When it was over, Ellie stepped back. "She's going to need rest. 3 weeks minimum. No chasing prey. No climbing. I'll leave antibiotics and pain meds, you'll need to hide them in meat." Jack nodded solemnly. "I'll handle it." As they left the shed, Ellie paused. "You know this isn't legal, right? You don't have a rehab license. If Fish and Wildlife finds out." "She came to me," Jack said simply. "I didn't chase her." She asked. Ellie studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe the forest knows something we don't." The days that followed settled into a rhythm Jack never expected. Twice a day, he brought fresh meat to the shed, venison, rabbit, once even a plump grouse. Each portion was mixed carefully with medication, measured to Ellie's instructions. He never lingered, never tried to touch the lynx or her cubs. He simply placed the food just inside the door, backed away, and waited at a distance. She always came. Never immediately, never trustingly, but eventually. She'd limp forward with cautious grace, eat, then retreat to the shadows, her golden eyes always watching. The cubs grew bolder by the day, tumbling outside into the sunlight, pouncing on fallen leaves, their play full of life and innocence. By the end of the second week, the mother lynx was putting more weight on her injured leg. The swelling had reduced, and she could move with far more ease, though still limping. Jack had started leaving the shed door wide open during daylight hours. She could go if she wanted. But she didn't. Then, on the morning Ellie was due back to check the splint, something unexpected happened. Jack approached with the usual bowl of meat, whistling low under his breath. But when he reached the shed, he stopped cold. The mother lynx was already outside. She sat in the grass near the door, her legs stretched out before her, her cubs nestled at her side. But it wasn't her presence that stunned Jack, it was what lay at her paws. A freshly killed rabbit. It had been carefully placed, its body intact, as if offered, not dropped in haste, not abandoned. Deliberate. Jack's breath caught. "Is that, for me?" The lynx looked at him, held his gaze, and made a sound he had never heard from her before. A low, vibrating rumble. Not a growl. Not a purr. Something in between. It carried weight. Grief. Gratitude. Something that straddled the unknown. He crouched slowly, setting his own bowl of meat to the side. "What are you telling me, girl?" The lynx stood, limped to her cubs, and chirped softly. The smaller one, noticeably thinner than its sibling, stepped forward hesitantly, then retreated. The mother nudged it gently, encouraging it toward Jack. Jack froze. The message became painfully clear. She was giving him the sick cub. At first, the kitten resisted, whining, pressing back against its mother. But after another gentle push, it took a few wobbling steps toward Jack, its body trembling, its eyes wide with fear and confusion. Jack's hands shook as he reached out, moving with infinite care. The kitten didn't run. Didn't hiss. It simply stood there, unsure. He picked it up, barely breathing. It was warm, but its breathing was shallow. Its body, far too light. Jack looked up. The mother lynx sat back beside her stronger cub, watching silently. "She's asking me to save this one," Jack whispered. "She knows it's sick. She knows she can't help. So she's trusting me." He stood with the fragile bundle in his arms, heart aching at the weight, and the meaning, of the moment. "I'll do my best," he said softly to her. "I swear it." Jack cradled the sick kitten in his arms as if it were made of glass. The tiny body trembled with every breath, its fur dull and uneven despite weeks of nourishment. He brought it inside the cabin for the first time, clearing space beside the wood stove, where the warmth might ease the shivers racking its frame. An old wooden crate became a makeshift nursery, lined with flannel, filled with quiet prayers. When Ellie arrived, the look in her eyes said it all. She examined the kitten carefully, her brow furrowed deeper with each observation. "Respiratory infection," she murmured, "and something more, maybe congenital. The heart's not right. Too fast. Too weak." Jack felt his stomach twist. "Can we fix it?" Ellie hesitated, her voice soft. "We can try. But the odds are against it." She administered the first dose of antibiotics, taught Jack how to feed it with a syringe of special formula, and gave strict instructions: warmth, quiet, hydration. Every 2 hours. Day and night. And so began a different kind of vigil. Jack slept in his armchair beside the crate, rousing himself through the night to feed the kitten, to wipe away the congestion that gathered at its tiny nose and mouth. He talked to it in low tones, telling stories about the forest, about his father, about a life carved from wild silence. "Your mama knew," he'd whisper during those quiet dawn hours. "She chose me. You must have mattered something fierce for her to do that." Each day, Jack carried the kitten outside in a towel-lined basket to sit near the shed. The mother lynx would approach, slowly, cautiously. She'd sniff her baby gently, sometimes licking its ears with a rough tongue, then retreat to her healthy cub, always watching, always waiting. Despite their best efforts, the signs grew more troubling. The kitten slept longer. Ate less. Its breaths became more labored, its eyes duller. Ellie returned every few days, adjusting medication, changing the feeding schedule, hoping, like Jack, that love and care might overcome biology. But on the 17th morning, as pale sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, Jack held the tiny creature in his hands and felt its breath falter, then stop. He didn't speak. He just sat, still as stone, as tears carved quiet lines through the stubble on his weathered cheeks. Later, wrapped in one of his father's old shirts, the kitten was laid at the edge of the woods. The mother lynx was already there. She approached the bundle with reverence, sniffing it, letting out a low, keening cry, a sound so mournful it made Jack's chest ache. She looked at him with those luminous eyes, then, in a moment that shattered him, stepped forward and gently pressed her head to his hand. The first touch she had ever initiated. Then she picked up her lost cub and disappeared into the trees with her surviving kitten at her side. Jack stood there for a long time, the silence louder than any storm. For 3 days, the shed sat empty. Jack left food out, but it remained untouched. The blankets lay rumpled, marked only by the faint scent of fur and something harder to name, grief, maybe. Or memory. The clearing around the shed, once alive with cubs tumbling over each other, had fallen silent, as if mourning the absence of its wild visitors. Jack tried to tell himself this was how it should be. That the lynx had done what she was meant to do, taken her surviving kitten back to the forest, where they belonged. That the bond they'd shared, no matter how strange and sacred, was never meant to last. But still, he watched. Every morning, every evening, he found himself glancing toward the tree line. Listening for a chirp. For movement. For some sign that she was still out there. And then, on the 4th morning, as the fog lifted off the ground and the sky turned the color of fresh ash, he opened his cabin door and froze. She was back. The mother lynx sat calmly on his porch, her splinted leg now mostly healed, though still stiff. Her remaining cub, noticeably larger, perched beside her, alert but no longer frightened. The moment Jack stepped outside, the lynx stood and limped slowly to meet him, her golden eyes soft, unwavering. She sniffed his outstretched hand, just once, before settling at his feet. Jack sank to the porch beside her, stunned. "You came back," he whispered. "After everything, you came back." They sat like that for nearly an hour, man and beast, bathed in morning light. The kitten eventually grew curious and padded closer, brushing Jack's knee before darting back. The lynx remained still, her breath slow, steady, her presence grounding. For the next 2 weeks, they stayed. Jack didn't try to cage them, didn't feed them beyond what was necessary. He knew their time here was ending. Each day, the cub ranged farther. Each day, the mother climbed higher, limped less. Ellie returned, removed the splint, and declared her healed enough to return to the wild. "She's ready," she told Jack softly. "So are you." He nodded, but his heart pulled taut. The release happened in Cotton Ridge Clearing, where the bond had first begun. Jack carried the carriers from his truck, setting them gently on the grass. The kitten burst out first, darting toward the tree line with youthful speed. The mother followed more slowly, stepping into the wild like it had never left her. She paused only once, turned to look at Jack. One long, final gaze. Then she vanished into the trees. Jack stood for a long time afterward, listening to the wind moving through the leaves like a goodbye spoken in a language he couldn't translate, but somehow still understood. Winter came fast to the mountains that year. Snow layered the world in silence, blanketing the trails Jack once walked with the lynx trailing behind him. The shed, now quiet, held only faint traces of what had passed, a few stray tufts of fur, claw marks on the wooden doorframe, and memories so vivid they felt like ghosts. Jack went about his life as he always had, splitting wood, guiding the occasional winter hunt, fixing chairs and tables for folks in town. But nothing felt quite the same. Every time he passed the tree line, every time he heard the crunch of snow underfoot, he listened a little harder. Waited a little longer. Hoped for a flicker of movement in the shadows. They were never yours, Ellie reminded him gently one afternoon, bringing by a venison stew and her usual blend of bluntness and care. But they mattered to you. And that matters. He only nodded. There was no need to explain what couldn't be said. Spring unfurled slowly. Ice melted into rivulets. Wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth. The birds returned, filling the mornings with song. Jack began walking farther into the forest, always hoping, never expecting. Then one bright morning in May, as he sat on the same downed log in Cotton Ridge clearing where it all began, he saw her. Not the mother lynx. But a younger female, smaller, lighter in build, with a coat marked by the same spotted pattern. She carried herself with the same cautious grace. Behind her, 2 cubs tumbled through the underbrush, chirping and swatting at beetles. Jack didn't move. The lynx saw him. She froze for a moment, ears twitching, body tense. Then, slowly, she sat. Not close. Not trusting. But not running either. Her cubs played fearlessly, one chasing the other in circles as she watched both them and the man on the log. Jack smiled, heart swelling with something too deep for words. "Hello there," he said softly. "You look like her." The lynx blinked slowly. A long pause. A tilt of the head. Recognition. Maybe. Maybe not. But Jack felt it all the same, a thread connecting this wild creature to the one who had once limped into his clearing, who had entrusted him with her young, who had saved his life in return. Eventually, she chirped, calling her cubs. They bounded back to her side. She rose, gave Jack one last glance, and slipped silently into the forest. Gone. But not lost. Jack sat on the log for a long time, the sun warming his face, the breeze rustling the canopy above. He wasn't sad. Not anymore. The ache had become something else, something gentler. A quiet joy. A knowing. He had been part of something rare. Something real. And in the hush between the trees, he could still feel it. In a world where we often draw hard lines between wild and tame, between instinct and emotion, one moment in a quiet forest shattered those boundaries. Jack Whittaker didn't rescue a lynx family to feel heroic. He did it because something unspoken passed between him and a wounded creature, something ancient, raw, and deeply human. The mother lynx didn't come seeking food. She came seeking trust. And she gave it, to a man she should have feared. That choice, the courage of the wild to believe in us, reminds us that we, too, have a responsibility. Not to control nature. Not to tame it. But to listen to it. To protect it. To meet its vulnerability with care instead of conquest. Love doesn't always wear a human face. Sometimes, it has yellow-green eyes, a limp, and a voice that chirps softly through the trees. Jack's story teaches us that the greatest acts of love are not always loud or easy. Sometimes, they're quiet. Painful. Bittersweet. But they leave echoes. In fur-lined dens, in the pawprints along a snowy trail, and in the hearts of those who dared to care. So as you carry this story with you, ask yourself. When the wild places look to us for help, will we rise to meet them with empathy, or turn away in fear? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world a little differently, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories from the edge of the wild. Don't forget to hit the bell icon, so you never miss the next incredible journey.